Welcome to Evidence Based, a new Harbinger psychology podcast. I'm your host, Cassie Stossel. On today's episode, we're talking about help for high conflict couples with Jennine, Estes, Powell, and Jacqueline Wielick, authors of Help for High Conflict Couples. Jennine is founder of Estes Therapy, a group practice in San Diego, California that concentrates on relationship counseling. As a licensed marriage and family therapist who is certified in emotionally focused therapy, EFT, she has been helping countless couples repair their rifts and reinvigorate their connection for more than 20 years. She also trains other therapists and serves as a mentor for colleagues. Her aim is to strategically apply empirically based techniques to create positive, long-term change. Learn more at www.estestherapy.com. Jacqueline is a licensed marriage and family therapist and owner of her own private practice, Therapy by Jackie. She has a Master of Science in Marriage and Family Therapy and degrees in both psychology and sociology. With a focus on couples, relationships, attachment, trauma, and emotions, Jackie's passion is helping people find deep joy in themselves and in their relationships, using her advanced training in research-based theories such as EFT and Gottman method couples therapy. Jackie previously worked at the Gottman Institute for 5 years, one of the world's leading research institutes for couples and relationships, where she was exposed to their revolutionary research on love and relationships. Learn more at www.jackiewielick.com. Hi, Jennine and Jackie. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Hello.
Thank you for having us. Come on.
So I thought we could start our conversation just sort of defining what is a high conflict couple?
High conflict couples, people think of the screaming, berating, degrading, cursing, yelling, smashing things. Yes, some of that is high conflict, but it's also the complete other side of severe ice cold shutdowns. So we can have we don't talk and things get shut down so severely, withdrawn so massively that's also high conflict. So high conflict ranges from the screaming, yellings, attackings to the ice cold shutdowns.
Mm-hmm. And you can also, like, a good indicator of if you're wondering, am I high conflict, is knowing how quickly things escalate. Usually with high conflict couples, things escalate like in a 0 to 60 way, like so quickly. It's like 1 second we're just talking about the cat litter, and then the next second you're like completely furious or completely shut down. If that sounds like you, then that might be a good indicator you're high conflict.
Right. The distress levels are so intense, and you can be talking about the dishes, and next thing you know is that intensity just floods in and disconnection, and we're going towards two different corners.
How much of this comes from what is modeled for us as children? Like, do you find that high conflict couples are likely to have had high conflict parents?
That's a good question. A lot of times we might model what we watch, right? So some clients who come into our sessions are saying, hey, this is how conflict was. We got big and loud, and others where we just didn't talk about anything. We didn't have any fights, and nobody talked about hard things. So a lot of what we watch growing up can impact how conflict is resolved or not resolved. That does play a huge part, but also research shows that we can learn how to have really healthy communication styles, even though our parents did terrible at it.
Totally. It's not like, it's not like written in the stars that like just because you watch this, like you're doomed for like high conflict for life, which is really cool. Yeah.
My husband grew up in a very high conflict household. Like, his mother high conflict communicates with him. And so early in our relationship, we, talked about what our communication style was going to be, because I totally shut down if there's any yelling. I was like, I can't properly communicate if we're elevated. And like, so we're different than that, but like, he originally started out trying to communicate in the same way his mom did.
Of course, because that's what he knew.
Yeah.
Which is so reasonable. Yeah.
And if we have somebody who's coming at us really quick, really hot, our initial reaction is to always be prepared, always get ready with an explanation, defend, explain, try to de-escalate, defuse things by explaining. But that defensive reaction can then show up in our current relationships of like, I'm already ready to answer questions and respond, but it can become a bit of a withdrawal versus being engaged.
That's interesting.
But I think like when you're asking about like people's parents and their conflict and how it ties in, like the first thought that I had was about trauma. Because what we don't see is like, oh, just because your parents were this way, you are this way. But what we do see is if you had trauma in your past. So let's say that somebody watched a really high conflict parent situation model for them, but it was actually so high conflict that it felt like traumatic for that person. We do see trauma as a indicator that somebody is more likely to be high conflict in their own relationships. You know what I mean?
Is that like a defense mechanism then, how they communicate because of witnessing how they felt the trauma?
I wouldn't say defensive, it's more just like I guess a little bit defensive, like protective, like the body just like goes into the state of fight or flight because it was so triggering or traumatic in the past.
Right. The body remembers, as Jackie describes that, the body remembers, oh, conflict's happening. I need to go into this protective move. And what do I need to do to take care of myself? And there's a lot of different moves we get into to survive it. And we love those parts that we had to have it as a kid. Like we needed them. It helped us. For me, rage was so helpful for me growing up. It helped protect me. Does not help me in my relationship now.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And a lot of your book focuses on EFT. Can you talk about what that is and how it can help high conflict couples?
Yeah, so EFT is emotionally focused therapy, and it's a research based approach for working with couples that shows long term change, but quicker. It's a shorter term therapy approach, so it's not a lifelong sentence of doing counseling. And what it focuses on is really diving into the root of the disconnection of feeling insecure in the relationship and finding new experiences, new ways of feeling securely connected. And what we have to do is really like help couples understand this pattern that they get into. It they call it the negative cycle. And when that negative cycle comes up, couples have to be able to recognize their part of that cycle, really press the pause button, dive into more vulnerable emotions, because vulnerability draws closeness. And so the whole goal of EFT is helping couples learn how to reach in vulnerable ways versus attacking, aggressive, reactive ways. And getting a sense of secure connection, of feeling like you're there for me. I can count on you. You have my back no matter what. If the going gets tough, I can reach for you, right? We need that sense of security.
Mm-hmm. And EFT is such a cool therapy approach too, because it's experiential, which I think is what makes our book really exciting. Is like there's exercises and experiences that people are having in the book while they're reading it. And then you would experience that too in a therapy session. Like in a therapy session, people are experiencing feeling more de-escalated, and we do things with that when they're triggered. They're experiencing being connected with their partner. We have people talk to each other in the session. Just like in our book, we would recommend share with your partner this vulnerable thing or this vulnerable thing when it's appropriate and once things are cooled off a little bit. That's one of my favorite parts of EFT, is just the getting to experience the security and connection in a new way. It's beautiful. Sometimes it feels like watching a Hallmark movie in our sessions. You get these high conflict people, and then they eventually months later are like just in these beautiful moments hugging each other. It's just the coolest. It's the coolest thing.
And couples in counseling, the clinician typically will help when somebody's in distress, help them understand what's happening in their body in that moment. It's like the therapist helps them press the pause button, identify what's happening in that moment, take a deep dive, and then talk to each other in a deeper, more vulnerable way. And that's where our book is like helping people understand what's happening in their body emotionally and physically, and pressing the pause button and learn how to talk to each other different.
Yeah, that's what I loved about your book. This is the first book with EFT that I've read. And so I liked how accessible it seemed. And I feel like, when you hear the term high conflict couple, a lot of people probably would separate because of being high conflict. And this feels like hopeful in a way of sort of turning yourself to self awareness, but also compassion for the other person. Because once you do understand what's going on for you, you can more easily understand what's going on for them. So I really liked that approach, and it did seem really, really tangible.
Thank you. We've actually had a lot of couples who are not high conflict find a lot of value in this book and apply it into their own relationship, even though they're not identifying as high conflict. And it just really helps with, let's figure out what's going on. Let's make sense of what's going on your side of the street, your partner's side of the street.
Yeah. Yeah, and you start off going into sort of the process of working through this with two boundaries that you offer couples to start to rebuild their relationship. Can you talk about what those two boundaries are?
Mhm. One of them that we set is, don't bring the kids into this. Don't fight in front of the kids. Don't, drag them into this as for these problems. I think that that's really, really important. And that's a huge value for me and Jennine. We love that one. And then the second one is, if you have a problematic relationship with substances, and we would define problematic in a lot of different ways, but when we're thinking of EFT2, it's anything that's making you escape and withdraw from the relationship and emotions, right? So even if maybe you wouldn't meet criteria for addiction, but you're smoking weed every time you have a feeling with your partner and you don't want to talk to them about it, that's something that we would want you to refrain from doing while you're rebuilding the relationship. So just for people who are using it in an escapist way, right? That's something we would press pause on only for the time being while we're doing this book. And the reason for that is because we are working on facilitating new interactions of connection. And we want to kind of get in the way of anything that can further create disconnection.
For me, I'm always working on this, but what are some of your tips for setting some boundaries?
There's a woman, Dr. Becky. She has the company Good Inside. She's amazing. She defines boundaries in a fantastic, easy to understand way that really reflect like our values in the book, which is that a boundary is something that you can say and you do that requires no change on behalf of the other person, right? So the difference, a lot of people think a request is a boundary, right? Saying like, um, I don't,
Like, don't talk to me this way,
yes.
or don't do this thing. That's considered a request, where we actually need to move our body of, if you keep talking to me this way, I'm going to have to leave. So what that means is I'm going to change my behavior. I'm going to choose something within my body to set a boundary and remove myself so this doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah. And a really great boundary that a lot of that we recommend for a lot of our high conflict couples is with that removing of just yourself of the body, is doing it in a way where it's creates a lot of safety in the relationship. We call it a negotiated break in our book, but just saying like, I feel really hurt, really overwhelmed, really scared when I notice our interactions escalate to this way. I'm going to need to take a 30-minute break. At exactly 30 minutes from now, let's come back and talk about the problem. So we don't want to just like leave our partners hanging and do another disappearing act, and the partner feels abandoned in that moment. But we always want to reassure them we're going to come back and talk about it, but it's also not okay to continue like those same behaviors that were so escalating and unsafe emotionally.
Yeah, I really like that distinction. I think that makes boundary setting seem much easier to put it back onto yourself versus expecting something from someone else.
100%. Yeah.
I want to talk about attachment styles because they seem to play a large role. Can you talk about the role that they play with high conflict couples?
So, when we have attachment styles, it's basically if we have had insecure attachments with growing up with our caregivers, that attachment style, if it's more of an anxious reaction, disorganized, avoidant, right? If we're not feeling secure, we're going to look through that lens in our relationship. So I can't count on people. You're not there for me. I'm scared. I'm feeling nervous. I don't feel securely connected. So then the reactions, how they reach for reassurance or don't reach for it, really plays a part because of how they learned how relationships have been and feeling connected or secure. So the more threatened I feel, the more alarmed I am, the more difficult it is to regulate. And we do these kind of chaotic reaches, or will avoid reaching, needing reassurance, but I'm not going to cause conflict, so I'm not going to tell you what I need, and so I'm going to stay quiet, and I'm going to avoid anything, but I'm not okay inside, right? And so, but if somebody who has the secure attachment, they feel secure enough to say, hey, I'm not feeling good right now, can you reassure me? And they can reach and be clear and lean in for comfort and go vulnerable.
Briefly, we talked about, you mentioned fight or flight earlier. Can we talk about how examining our responses in those moments can help decrease the conflict in a relationship?
It's interesting because the more that we are aware of what's happening in our body, we can be aware of our reactions, the more we can press the pause button. But there is this fight or flight with a lot of trauma. For instance, I had mentioned my ability to go anger and rage so quickly, right? As a child, rage protected me. It was so helpful. And so my body, if it gets dysregulated, I could go to rage so fast because it helped me. But it doesn't help now. So I have to actually press that pause button to figure out, like, oh, I want to go into rage. What's really going on? And I need to gain that scaffolding and structure of, like, what's actually beneath that anger side to figure out what I'm actually feeling. I'm actually scared that my partner doesn't love me. I'm afraid I don't matter right now. I'm afraid you're not going to hear me. So rage kicks in so I can be heard, so I can get through the wall, so I can throw grenades at the wall and get you to hear me and come close. The more I'm aware of what's happening, then I can start to reach in a different way. But I have to press pause. I have to know the signs of my body, right? And I'm just using myself as an example. My body was going to get this intense feeling in the stomach and this kind of flood through heat that shows up. And the more I can identify what's happening in my body, I can press pause. I can figure out what I'm needing, how to regulate. And sometimes we need to shock that system to get me out of the rage, right? Like, I can't just yell at my partner. That's not going to fix things. My partner's not going to want to come cuddle with a cactus, right?
I love that.
Or a bomb, however you So we have to be able to, like, okay, I'm in super distress. And the most common pattern that shows up is we have a pursue withdrawal dynamic. And I'm describing my pursuer, but I come out with rage. I no longer come out in rage, but it's taken years of just identifying, this is the feeling that comes up. I want to attack my partner. I want to tell my partner everything they are doing that's causing me distress. The more I recognize what I'm reaching for is, I want my partner to come close, and I'm scared. Scared I don't matter. I'm scared that my partner is not going to come close. I'm going to panic inside. And if I can tie into that panicky, fearful side, the more I examine what's underneath it, the more I can start to identify when it's happening, press pause, share it clearly, reach clearly, and tell my partner, I'm just scared that I don't matter. Can you reassure me right now? Versus throwing a bomb. That vice versa, that withdraw, at times people might get fearful of the conflict and go into their shell. Think of a turtle, right? They go into their shell to protect, and they're going to hang out there. It's lonely in there, but they're hanging out and it's nice and cozy and safe. And the partner's like, where'd you go? Right? They might throw the bombs. They might try to pull them out. But that shutting down is because it's scary. I don't want fights. I don't want to get it wrong. I can't bear to not be enough. So I'm just going to stay quiet so I don't get it wrong anymore. But the more they shut down, the more, right, like, they're doing it in a protective way. If they can understand why they're shutting down, what they're actually needing in those moments is, I'm scared I'm going to get it wrong. Can you reassure me that I'm enough right now? Can you help me, right? So, examining that fight or flight response helps decrease the conflict because the more we recognize what it's really about, the intention behind it, helps our partners understand it, helps us put words to it.
Mm. That is such a beautiful example. And I feel like I love the example that you gave, Jennine, because it's so helpful to like see how it plays out in real life. Because this is so common. And we all like have these interactions with our partners to some degree, right? And the key that you're talking about that I think is so helpful is like that self-awareness. Like our book relies a lot on like the awareness of the reader to like get curious about, like Jannine's saying, what is underneath the rage? What's underneath the wanting to just shut down and go ice cold and quiet? And like that's a huge part of EFT is really identifying that really more vulnerable primary emotion and then sharing it successfully with the partner in a way that is not blaming and not critical and really soft, so that the person can hear it and see it and go, oh, that makes sense. And like then it actually, the conflict instead turns into this like really beautiful connecting like opportunity for closeness, you know?
Right. And when we have high conflict, when we talk about conflict, it's really about, is there safety in our relationship? Can I count on you to be there? And typically within high conflict couples, we have three different areas that really create high conflict. And one is through an attachment injury, so like an affair, a rupture, financial secrecies, things like that. Of I went or going through a birth of a kid or a miscarriage on your own, there's the safety of, I can't count on you, it's not safe. So we have a rupture. Another might be from having traumas of our own, having history of trauma that says, I can't count on people. So I'm going to be in an unsafe, protected space of a fight or flight. And then the third is, it's unsafe because for years I've reached for you, I've reached to get my needs met or tried not to cause problems, and it's been so long that I don't get my needs met and I am dying over here. It's not safe. I can't count on you. And so it's all about this sense of like lack of security, lack of safety.
Yeah, you're making me like re-examine so many things right now. Not about even me, but like about like my parents' relationship. They were not conflict, but my mom, when her dad died, she like kind of like went out of her mind and left my dad, and I'm feeling like it maybe came from that place of not feeling safe because of how she grew up, and now I'm like mind blown. You've just blown my mind.
Yeah. Well, I like that you brought that up, is that grief is one of the areas where attachment injuries happen. Of, I needed you during this time and where were you? I couldn't count on you. So I'm going to take care of myself. And that's actually a really common place where things, relationship patterns flood to the surface. And people are like, I can't do this anymore. I need to take care of myself. So,
Yeah, and I think what you're offering is just like a counterpoint to that. Like for my mom, just as the example goes, she didn't try to open up to my dad about it. Like she kind of closed off, and I think maybe assumed he wouldn't be there, even though he probably would have understood it better than anyone. And what you're offering and being self-aware about why you're reacting in a certain way can just change the trajectory of your relationship.
so with EFT, there's the three stages that we work from. And the first stage, it's the de-escalation phase, right? It's like putting the dragon to sleep and understanding whose move does what and why, right? What's the intention behind it? So if you think about a fire, some people look at the fire and say, hey, let's go put the fire out. We're going to go take the towel and try to put out the fire. Or other people see the fire and say, wait, let's wait for the fire to burn out, right? We're going to kind of step away from the fire in hopes to help it burn out. So both are doing it in hopes for a sense of connectivity and closeness, but their attempts come from two different angles or two different styles. So stage one really focuses on what are our techniques and strategies on how we're handling the distress what's underneath it, right? We have some really raw, vulnerable emotions. In high conflict couples, we can't share vulnerability because it can be used against you at times. So, with high conflict, we need the scaffolding and the structure all set up and really de-escalating it. And that's where EFT comes into play, is really de-escalating it. Then once we have it in a really nicely de-escalated phase where the couple knows exactly their moves, their side of the street, how they react, and they can take ownership of it, then we can start to move in to the second phase, which is like it's like getting that new experience, right? Getting a corrective emotional experience, taking risks with each other and going vulnerable, doing the repair that really like corrects how the affair hurt or how those ruptures happen. So there's a lot of repair happening. And then that third phase is really kind of dotting the I's, crossing the T's, making sure it works, right? And reorganizing, like discussing this cycle and understanding their experience in a new way. So within the book, we have the couples really focusing on creating that structure and making sense of their sides and getting out of de-escalation. And sometimes it takes a lot of work to do it. It might take a long time with high conflict couples, especially for clinicians if they're listening to this as high conflict couples. The change is a lot slower because we have a lot of ruptures, a lot of injuries. What's that phrase? If you can kill somebody with 1,000 paper cuts, right? A death by 1,000 paper cuts, I think is the phrase. And so the process is going to take a lot longer and it's a lot slower because we have to create some scaffolding and we need to get the structure all set up and in place and the de-escalation to happen and the emotional regulation.
We'll be right back after this short break.
I'm Dr. Lindsay Gibson, author of Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents. Growing up with emotionally immature parents can affect their adult children in several ways. Most of all, it affects the child's ability to trust themselves as adults and to see themselves as people of value who have healthy entitlements to respect and their own individuality. So join me on this adventure of self-discovery. For more details, go to adultchildrencourse.com.
New Harbinger online courses, self-help for everyone. Do you find that in this work that both parties of the couple come sort of ready to be curious about, like, I'm just wondering how a couple gets to the point of like seeking help for this and how they can build that self-awareness to be curious?
Yeah, it's so interesting because couples at times they might talk about going to counseling for like 6, 7 years before they even seek it out. One partner might be ready to do the work. The other one they're mistrusting in the relationship. They don't believe any of it will work. And there's a lot of hesitation. And that is okay for anybody to feel because history says they will they will not connect. Nothing's going to work.
And we even wrote the book with the intention that one person in a couple might just be the only person to read the book. And that is totally fine. And with EFT, it's really cool because it shows sometimes you only need one person to go in there and make different moves and have this new awareness to change the interaction because they're changing the dynamic of how they're showing up. But yeah, the listeners might not be able to see, but when you asked that question, both me and Jennine were laughing, going, nope, most of the time you don't get both.
Yeah, both of our heads.
Nope, most of the time you don't get two enthusiastic people saying, we love therapy, let's go. So I would just give listeners like a lot of hope that if you're in the situation where you're like, okay, now I know I'm high conflict, now I know I love EFT, this is resonating with me, I'm excited to learn, but there is no way my partner will ever go into a therapy session with me. That's okay. That's cool. You can still read our book. You can still do EFT on your own.
So what Jackie is talking about is if you take a baby mobile, you pull on one side, the whole thing moves. And this is the same when it comes to whether it's individual counseling or reading the book by yourself, is that you can it only takes one person to step out of the pattern. So the more you understand the pattern, what's beneath it, you understand what's going on your side, you can predict how your partner is going to react. You can actually experience it a bit different and step out of the cycle. And by just stepping out of the cycle will have impact. And it can create a change because you're no longer playing the same game, which causes your partner to shift how they react, shift how they respond. So we did write the book knowing most likely a high conflict couple, both people are not going to read the book. Or they might buy it and they might get into a fight at the first chapter and then not continue. So one person can still have massive impact. It's hard because it will feel like you're the only one lifting, carrying the weight. But that's okay because it's worth fighting for, especially if you have kids.
Yeah.
What can we do different?
And it's cool to note too that like a great part of the book and changing our interactions so that we can hopefully create a new pattern in the cycle is like you can be aware of your side of the street and show up and do your part. And we want to let people know too that you still cannot control or change your partner's actions, right? So this, I guess, is not to say that like you can show up to your side of the street and you're totally in control of how they're going to show up. Nope, that's not the case. And at the same time, we interact in our relationships as a part of like this cycle and pattern of behaviors, like this baby mobile. And when you change, it will change the dynamic, right?
Yeah, I think that's really hopeful. One part I want to talk about, we've definitely touched on sort of the primary emotion and then what's behind it, but I want to go a little more in depth on this because it's a big part of your section on cooling down. So, can you guys talk about what do primary and secondary emotions have to do with the cooling down part, and what are the differences between the two types of emotions?
Yeah, well, I think it's so important for cooling down because typically when we're not cooled down and we're in that escalated phase, we are just hanging out in our secondary emotions. And secondary emotions are reactions to the primary emotions that we're feeling. And those are the emotions that get lots of attention and lots of airtime, and they're very, very loud, right? They might be things like anxiety. They might be things like our reactive anger. It's really important to know the difference because the primary emotion, they're called primary because they come first, right? And those are the most soft, vulnerable, core feelings that we might be having, like the sadness, maybe like fear of abandonment, fear that we're not good enough, right? Things like joy and excitement are primary emotions too. So that's cool to notice. It's really important because think of like if you're in an interaction, like right now, and I just like started yelling at you, you would naturally pull away and distance yourself. But right now in this interaction, if I just started sharing how I'm feeling and I started crying, you would like naturally want to lean towards me and learn more. So like being able to share our primary emotions with our partners is a key part of this new interaction of vulnerability because it really sets our partners up for success. It helps them hear us more.
And a lot of people think that if you ask them about this initial reaction, most people will say, I just feel frustrated. I have nothing else. And I'm just frustrated and I'm angry. And frustration and anger is that secondary emotion. But and as Jackie said, it's highlighted. It's the most familiar. It's the safest for us. And it's this reactive way. And it takes us a long time to actually recognize what's below. Because if you ask me when I'm frustrated, if I have a primary emotion, no, I'm frustrated. I'm just mad. My partner's not listening to me. You're not seeing me. I'm always hearing I'm getting it wrong. And so that's a secondary emotion. And so education and learning that we actually have something going on primary, like this initial response, but it's a hot second. Most of the time we just bypass it and we don't even know that it happened. And so education is about learning that there's actually more to it. If you think of like a flower, above the ground, there's the flower, the thorns, the leaves. Below the ground are the roots. And the primary are the roots, which Jackie's discussing, is there's this fear, this vulnerable, raw emotions. And high conflict couples, we can't go to vulnerability right away because it's not safe yet. Once we have some safety, we can start accessing that vulnerability. And clinicians sometimes might jump really quickly to the vulnerable emotions, not knowing that it can be used against them. So we have to really be cautious and diligent on getting that structure. And the more that you can understand that vulnerable, raw emotion that's underneath what's happening, what we're longing for, is I'm actually scared that you'll reject me and you won't want me. Most of the time we're just like, no, I'm just pissed off that you gave me the look, right? Like you looked at me again, or you took that breath and I'm pissed, right? Or right, we can feel that temperature by just a breath and we don't realize that there's so much more going on. So education, I always say education is power. For us, the more we are aware of what's happening and being able to tune into it and find that vulnerability is such a significant thing. And it can be painful. So if you're listening and you're finding out what you're longing for and you're not getting it, the more you tune into that need, the pain can hurt worse at times, but it's important for you to recognize and know what you're fighting for. And we can't get our partner to change right away, but we can start to identify, this is why I get in so much distress. This is why, because it hurts so deep.
I can't stop thinking about Inside Out 2 as you were talking. Have you guys seen
that.
it?
Yes. Love it.
I literally I loved the first one, but I shed a tear about anxiety just because I've spent so much of the last few years deep with anxiety. And I was like, she's just trying to help me. And I was like crying after I left the theater. But yeah, I feel like everyone should watch that.
I agree. You know, when Inside Out first came out, the first one, my staff and I, we all went and watched the movie together, and it was so meaningful. And then the second one that came out was bringing my daughter in, and she's 4 years old, and we're like, yeah, there's different emotions, and there's anxiety, and just helping her understand. But there's this whole world going on inside our brains, right?
Yeah, exactly. So we've mentioned a lot about how folks in a high conflict couple may have some trauma. With trauma, a lot of triggers can come up. How can you recognize when you've triggered your partner, and what can you do in the moment?
Oh, yeah. One thing I wanted to say, and then I want to hear your thoughts on this too, Jennine, is that you can probably tell if you triggered your partner because you're going to be talking about like the dishes or the cat litter, and then the reaction is going to go to that 0 to 60 place where their reactions are not matching the situation. And you might have a moment, we talk about this in the book, where you go like, huh? Like, am I going crazy? Like, I thought we were just like, hey, babe, we need to do the dishes before people come over. And then now we're like freaking out, and it's like bombs are getting thrown. And why is this so intense? So usually when you see that 0 to 60 really intense reaction that doesn't match the context, it doesn't make sense, then you can probably be sure that your partner got triggered.
So here's an example of what she's describing. And sorry to my wife, I'm going to share. My wife is gone, and it's a Sunday afternoon. She took our kid out, and so I did the dishes. It's around noon. Every single dish in the house, I put it in the dishwasher. Nothing's in the sink. I put the dishwasher on. I started the dishwasher. Okay, everybody thinks this is a great idea, right? How lovely. I put every dish away in it, started the dishwasher. She comes home and gets upset that the dishes were started. Okay, and I was just like, what? You're crazy. Like, what is going on? I just thought she was just crazy. Why are you getting mad at me for doing the dishes? Like, most people are going to be like, oh my gosh, you did the dishes. But what happened was it wasn't something she predicted. right? Unpredictability is trauma. And her body said that was the most dangerous thing at that moment. And she got pissed and mad about it. And I was then reactive, like, why are you getting mad at me for the dishes, right? Most people would love me for doing the dishes, right? And it was an interesting moment, is that was the indicator, because it didn't match. And I thought she was just nuts. I was like, you were just being nuts right now. What is your problem? But really what it is that trauma came in and it wasn't the way she had planned the rest of the day. She needed to plan the whole day, and she didn't predict that she was going to have to unload the dishwasher and then redo it. Her plan is we'd run it at night, so it's predictable. She knows every morning she unloads it. My wife is more of the kitchen person than I am. And so it wasn't something she predicted and planned for. So that's like a identifiable thing of how is it that we can recognize that we hit somebody's trauma, is it doesn't make sense, doesn't match the situation.
And then when you know what that trauma trigger is, it allows so much space for compassion. Like what you're saying, I just love this example. It brings it to life so much, because it's like the initial response is like, you know, what? Like, you're crazy. Like, it's just kind of this like, you know, confused and disconnected place. But then once they talked about it and she figured out what's going on underneath, it brings so much empathy, compassion, vulnerability. It's like, well, of course, that's, you feel this way. How can we love her there and keep her safe there and talk about it in a different way?
Yeah. And the more that we understand unpredictability is a trauma trigger, it helps me kind of understand it. It doesn't take away, though, the frustrations or the like, why are you mad at me for doing the dishes? Or whatever the thing is. That one's just one of, I always just laugh at that one. We joke about it now because, you know, now we can do the dishes throughout the day. We're working on flexibility, whatnot. But it's just one of those pieces that if we know when it's going to happen, it becomes predictable for me as well. So I now know if there's something that's unpredictable, she might have this intense reaction, and I don't know what it's about, and I don't get it. It's probably trauma. And so we have to be like, what about this is upsetting you? So my reaction has to be different. Instead of getting defensive, because I want to, I have to be like, what about this upsets you? Can you help me understand it? And it might take her a bit to work through it until she actually gets to the root of it, right? And that's at times the trauma, is you don't know what it's about, and it doesn't make sense, because I can come in rationally trying to describe, I did the dishes, I got every single one, I didn't miss anything, I can even unload it, it's not that big of a deal. None of that's going to land because it hits trauma.
Yeah. And in our book, we have like one of my favorite parts is we help people. We call these like potholes, right? That you're like walking along with your partner and you think everything's fine. Like, she's gonna be so happy. She's gonna come home and like see the dishes are done and it's like, it's gonna be perfect. But then like we end up falling in these potholes really quickly. And those are our partner's trauma triggers or our trauma triggers, you know, whatever they are. And they are like, you don't know where they're going to be. They're these landmines that you step on and they explode in front of you. And it's like very stressful and unpredictable. And I love, Jennine, how you're talking about how like knowing each other's triggers creates predictability for each of you. And we have this section in our book where we have people reflect on their lives, identify their own potholes and their own like landmines of these like trigger spots. And we help people. There's a lot of prep for this, so it's not confusing. And the point is to just like be aware of them for yourself and hopefully share with your partners. So then people can say, hey, unpredictability is really triggering for me. That's going to be a pothole of mine. And then once that dish conversation comes up, it's like, well, oh yeah, here we are. Here's the unpredictability again. Makes total sense. We can have a new conversation around it, you know?
You guys are just giving me like free therapy right now. Like, I feel like
That's so fun.
I feel like I just realized something about my husband and I.
She's all light bulb.
Yeah. As I mentioned to you guys, I went through cancer treatment last year, and now I find that anytime I mention a sensation I'm having in my body, which is triggering for me, but my husband will immediately be like, you're fine. You're okay. Like if I say like I have a headache, it's like an immediate like, you're fine. Like he thinks he's soothing me, but he's also triggered because for so long, nobody was taking my symptoms seriously. And now I feel like I just unlocked why he's doing that because I get frustrated. I'm like, I know I'm fine. Like I just want to tell you I have a headache. Like it's not, so that makes total sense.
That's a pothole for
Yeah.
him. Now we know one of his.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of the trauma, the triggers. I want to get into a couple of positive questions. Why do couples need to celebrate the positives when rebuilding a new secure attachment?
If our partner hits target, we need to be able to let them know about that positive experience, not just as a thank you. Hey, thank you. That doesn't do it. It's more about like, when you did this behavior and you let me know that felt X, Y, and Z, it said this to me, this was the message I got. It's basically, we need to tell them, you hit target. I like it. Do more of it. So it helps our partner understand what behavior they did that helped, the message you got, and how to do more of it so we can recreate it. If we don't understand what we did that created a good positive change, we can't recreate it. If we don't know how we got down a certain street, the directions, how we got there, we can't recreate that. We need to know exactly which move had the positive impact, how it impacted, and how to do more of it. And the more that we can know, like, that was a good experience, then we can really try to replicate it, because the brain can change. Neuroplasticity, right? Our brain can change, and we can create these new experiences with each other. And we need to have that celebrated. And I really like high fives. Like, that was really good. I'm so proud of us. However, if you are a withdrawer, a person who doesn't like conflict and tries to put in like a lot of the positive swings, it can actually hurt it. So you have to be careful of not trying to be like, well, we did good this way, we did good that way. Here's what we did good here, because that becomes really as a defensive move versus a, what you did impacted me. I love how you were with me. You stayed present with me. You recognized how I felt. I felt seen. I felt like I mattered. Can you please do more of that? That's a very different experience.
One of the fight or flight responses that we talk about in the book too, that Jennine's mentioning to be like careful of here, it's fight, flight, freeze, and the last one is appease. Right. So it's important for people to know, like, there might be withdrawers who fall into that appeasing part that are like, they're like that, maybe using toxic positivity as a way to withdraw in the relationship, So there's like that huge difference between toxic positivity and like really real, like, vulnerability. But it's so cool to talk about the positives and integrate it. That's the whole like third stage of EFT, is like solidifying all the therapy progress. Because like Jennine is saying, neuroplasticity is real. And our whole book, the coolest thing about EFT is that there's so much neuroscience behind it. Our brains can change at any time. No matter how old you are, you can create new cycles of interaction with your partner. You can do this work.
I freaking love that.
Me too. It's so hopeful. Like, none of this that we're talking about, attachment styles, your negative cycle, your trauma triggers, your fight or flight response, anything we're talking about, none of this is unchangeable, which is to me like the most exciting thing ever. Like, how cool is that?
Yeah. And I feel like when I first started reading about attachment theory, years ago, it felt like very rigid. Like, this is my attachment style. This is why I react this way. But then there was nothing to like do about
Totally.
it.
Yes, I felt the same way.
Yeah. I'm like, okay, so I'm stuck like this. Great. As we wrap up, I want to ask, beginning this work can seem very daunting to some couples. What would you say to a couple just beginning to work through this to improve their connection and decrease conflict?
Don't stop because conflict arises, and don't be scared if your negative cycle or if the conflict is happening while you're doing this. this is not bad. Like you might hit speed bumps. You might have difficult moments. The cycle might come in. Maybe things get worse for a little bit because all the stuff's coming up to the surface. That is all totally fine and normal. Don't get scared of it. Like run towards it. Don't be scared because these tools are going to help.
Yeah, and that feels like a good note to end on, unless either of you have any final thoughts for the listeners.
Relationships are really painful. Like the pain is real. The distress is severe. Each moment when the conflict comes up, it's pretty severe. And then we can have these lightful, okay moments in between. But when the conflict comes up, that's the most critical move, is what happens then during the distress. So seek out individual counseling if couples counseling is an option. Talk to friends. Don't be alone in this. Everybody has their own distress. You're not alone in it. And also for the clinicians that listen to this, is a lot of clinicians are told that if they're uncomfortable in the high conflict couples, they need to go do the work. And in reality, the therapists that are sitting in it, their bodies are reacting to a situation that's distressing, and for them to trust in their bodies and put words to that versus like, I just need to go do work. We can use that to connect with our clients. Like, I'm scared to talk about this topic. If I'm feeling scared, you guys are probably feeling scared. So I think that the conflict impacts so many people, and there are ways out of it. There are ways of trusting in your body and tuning into your body to put words to it in a different way. Jackie and I have our website, helpforhighconflictcouples.com, to go to for the readers, also for clinicians, for resources. And we have a conference that we're putting on next year, hopefully in Las Vegas, the EFT Triage with Dr. Lisa Palmer Olson, to actually help clinicians really hone in and become experts of dealing with the high distress, high conflict. And so there is a lot of hope for a lot of clients. Please pick up the book. So.
Yeah, thank you both so much for your book and your work and just making this feel really accessible and possible. I think it's really going to help a lot of people. So thank you both for your time.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we're really excited about it. So thank you.
Do you and your partner fight all the time? Do you love each other but simply drive one another up a wall? Do you worry that you'll eventually burn out from all the conflict, arguments, and hurt feelings, and that your relationship will deteriorate? If you're seeking ways to increase love and intimacy and decrease reactionary behaviors like criticism, blaming, withdrawing, and defending, this book can guide you toward a place of harmony and understanding. Based in revolutionary science of attachment theory and evidence-based emotionally focused therapy, EFT, this is an effective research-based roadmap for helping high-conflict couples break free from painful and destructive habits. With this book, you'll uncover the root cause of your conflicts, both as individuals and as a couple. You'll also find simple strategies for creating an emotionally secure environment, as well as tips for managing triggers, de-escalating arguments, and cultivating a real and lasting connection. Feeling emotionally safe and secure in our relationship is a primal need, and it is integral for our health and well-being. If you're ready to transform conflict and chaos into unshakable closeness, this book will guide you every step of the way. Visit our website at www.newharbinger.com and use coupon code podcast25 to receive 25% off your entire order. New Harbinger Publications is an independent, employee-owned publisher of books on psychology, health, spirituality, and personal growth. For over 50 years, our evidence-based self-help books and pioneering workbooks have helped readers make positive changes to improve mental health and well-being. Founded by psychologists Matthew McKay and Patrick Fanning, New Harbinger is proud to be an employee-owned company. Our books reflect our core values of integrity, sustainability, compassion, and trust. Written by leaders in the field and recommended by therapists worldwide, New Harbinger books are practical, accessible, and provide real tools for real change. Join the New Harbinger Clinicians Club, a free membership club exclusively for mental health professionals. Sign up today and you'll receive a special welcome gift, 35% off all professional books, free client resources, free ebooks throughout the year, access to private sales, a subscription to our Quick Tips for Therapists email program, and more. Visit newharbinger.com/clinicians-club for more information. Do you have an idea for another episode? Do you want to send us a message? Our email address is podcast@newharbinger.com. We'd love to hear from you. This podcast was edited by Jesse Fancushion. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love if you rated, reviewed, and subscribed to the show, and we hope that you might share it with anyone who could benefit from the content. This podcast is not a substitute for counseling with a licensed provider.